Welcome back to Paris Lesbos. One of us is a pixie, the other is called Rena. Today we're continuing our descent into a segment we can probably call Lesbians Behaving Badly.
Badly is one word for it.
You'll remember the mentions of her in Mary Allen's episode, but Rotha Lintorn-Orman started out in the beginnings of the UK version of the Girl Scouts, and then driving an ambulance in World War One, only to end starting the first fascist organization in Britain. So, how do we get there? Well, as always, we start at the beginning. Rotha was born in England in February 1895 to an army major and his wife, whose father was a field marshal.
Do we know anything about where in England, or her childhood, or her friends?
I came across two or three different places. One suggested London, another place suggested more into the countryside. And since I haven't seen her birth certificate, it's not like I can make a conclusive statement.
Hmm. And her biographers tend not to focus on that area.
Not as much because it isn't the interesting part of her life. The interesting part everyone focuses on is after World War One.
Right. So we just don't know anything about her origins or background.
Well, we know a little bit. So the first mentions we get of Rotha are in relation to the Girl Guides, the UK version of the Girl Scouts. Initially, the Girl Guides did not exist. The movement was started for boys, but because it was so new, there wasn't as much oversight. So a bunch of girls joined by signing up with their first initials and last names. This is probably how Rotha became a troop leader at 14 with the help of her mother. They even went to a big event, which is how everyone figured out that there were actually girls in the guide movement, so the scout movement in the UK. Unlike our previous episode's protagonist, Rotha is too young to get involved with the suffragettes, so her first brush with anything militant or regimental is here, unless we count her family military history. And she likes this. Possibly in part as teenage rebellion, because good Edwardian young ladies are not supposed to be out enjoying so much strenuous outdoor activities.
So even though this isn't the suffragists, this is still a somewhat daring gathering of competent women and girls.
It is, and in Rotha's own words, she even had the honor to command the only two troops to be under royal patronage, the 1st and 2nd Bournemouth, Princess Louise's own. And in those days, the scouts and guides carried our own flag, the Union Jack.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can see where this would be similar to later fascist activities. My goodness.
And then came World War One, when Rotha was 19. She became an ambulance driver, first with the Women's Reserve Ambulance, and then for the Scottish Women's Hospitals. It is with the latter that she was sent to Serbia in 1916. According to her, she received several medals for her service, including for bravery. One of those is said to have been the Croix de Charité for rescues in Salonika, which may be for the fire that broke out in that city.
Oh boy, that sounds intense.
However, she is sent back home in 1917 due to contracting malaria. Unable to serve overseas for the rest of the war, Rotha started training drivers for the Red Cross at the motor school at Devonshire House.
Oh wow. So this is actually kind of a promotion. She's not just participating in it, she's actually training other people. Now, do we know anything about this time or other accounts to corroborate her bravery?
So I tried to find out more, especially the year she spent in Serbia. According to the Imperial War Museum's profile on her, she was part of the Ostrovo unit, Macedonia and Serbia, though it appears the information on that comes via a site like Ancestry, so I'd take that with some salt. I can't find a reference in it to exactly what Rotha did, but part of the general history of the unit is that its hospital was quite close to the front, and that part of the unit aided in evacuating Serbian civilians, as well as treating wounded from battles like the Battle of Gornichevo. Several thousand feet above sea level, by the way. They're up in the mountains. There's mountain passes that are narrow. There's mud everywhere.
Great conditions all around.
Also, by the sounds of it, malaria was always a problem for that unit. It may have been near a swamp, and there's talk of poor sewage management for the tents.
Hmm.
It's not surprising then that Rotha caught malaria and got sent back to England.
Love it. Sounds like a wonderful war for her. God. So you talked about before that she had this opportunity for leadership training drivers um, once she got sent back. How do things look for Rotha after the war?
According to an article by Edward White, Rotha drifted after the war and took up drinking and drugs. I cannot confirm the vices part, though there are rumors from about 10 years later.
Given the conditions that we know that she suffered in the war, it makes sense that she would be taking to drinking and drugs.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the possibility of what that was later, but this information is in addition to what sounds like frequent illnesses, which I've heard of people who have contracted malaria having flare ups later in life, like years later, even, so I would not be surprised if that is also a factor.
Sounds like she's having a great time.
Also, keep in mind some of the rumors may have been created to discredit her later on in the 1920s, but I will say I do agree with White that she is drifting in the immediate aftermath of the war.
I mean, a lot of people were.
In the case of Rotha, her next actions have always given me the feel of someone who doesn't know what to do with themselves and latches on to the first thing that sticks and makes them not feel like shit. By White's account, she moved to a dairy farm in Somerset, but kept up the military appearance from her war service by keeping her hair short and displaying her medals on her jacket. Naturally, this caused talk, but she kept going. Our next mentions of Rotha are 5 years later, when she's hearing about Mussolini in Italy. 7 months after hearing about that, she started the first fascist organization in Britain, and her reasoning for this was unusual.
I mean, as opposed to the usual reasons, what is the connection here? I mean, is there something that Mussolini is doing that inspires her?
So in 1923, Mussolini is making fascist moves in Italy, but according to the writer Julie Gottlieb, Rotha also probably heard of the Labour Party sending a delegation to a Socialist Party conference in Hamburg. According to Rotha, she was digging in her garden in the spring of 1923 when she suddenly realized that communists were ruining the country. Someone needed to do something about that, so she became that someone.
Okay. So she's not really attributing it to any one person or event, but it sounds like something's brewing.
Something is brewing, and soon after, she founded the British Fasciti, a far right paramilitary organization that later becomes known as the British fascists. You see, it was only in 1924 that the thought came to her that an organization about keeping Britain British shouldn't have an Italian sounding name. I have to agree with Edward White here that a dairy farm isn't the best place to find communists, and that she was probably more terrified of wasting her life away in the fields with the cows.
Those darn communists always turning the milk sour.
You may also be wondering how Rotha even funded this, because it certainly wasn't on a farm worker's salary. In reality, her mother gave her £50,000, the greater half of her mother's personal fortune. According to inflation calculators, if we assume this was a lump sum given in 1926, that would be just about £3.9 million or about 4.8 million US dollars in 2025.
That's a lot of money to give your wandering daughter to start a fascist movement.
I cannot speak to the thought process of Rotha's mother, but considering she got involved with the whole Girl Guides movement and having it actually involve girls and also being the daughter of a soldier and the wife of another, I think she could initially overlook some things.
Or maybe even agreed with some things, who's to say?
What was further odd about the movement, though, was that Rotha was not initially the president of the organization that she created.
And through her mother funded. Weird. Who was the leader?
A Lord Garvagh was instead. He was then replaced in 1924 by Brigadier General Robert Blakeney, who then left in 1926.
Now, were these guys actually the leaders, or were they just the leaders on paper because we're all fascist here and a woman can't possibly lead? What's the deal with this?
It may have been a bit of a combo. This gets complicated because a lot of it is the idea that a woman shouldn't be in charge. It's an organization started and funded by a woman, and that has a high number of women in positions of leadership compared to what other fascist movements in the next 10 years in the UK are going to have. But it also goes against a worldview that's about masculine virility and traditional values. So the short answer is it's very complicated.
Got it. It's a lot of cognitive dissonance going on amongst these female fascists. And the male ones, probably, for that matter.
Yes, I do think we can harken back a bit to Mary Allen's episode where there's a lot of rules for thee, but not for me. Like thinking of yourself as the exception, but everyone else needs to do this other thing.
Got it.
By the 1926 general strike, the group has split. One side wanted to merge with the Organization for the Maintenance of Supplies, and the women higher up in the BF, as I'm now going to call it, wanted to retain their own independence in the movement.
Can I just say, the Organization for the Maintenance of Supplies sounds so generic. I mean, my goodness, I would if I had a fascist organization, that's what I would call it. Fly under the radar. So they've had this split, and we're now basically the lady fascists versus the man fascists. Where does that leave us?
I mean, I wouldn't exactly call it that because there are still men in the BF, but it is only after this split that we see a woman actually officially be in charge.
Finally, equality in our fascist movement.
As to Rotha herself, by the sounds of it, she took a larger role in the organization after this, but we still don't know much in the way of details. There were rumors that she wore a sword at private rallies. At a fascist Christmas party in 1925, she dressed as Father Christmas for 600 kids. At another costume event in London, she came dressed as a grandfather.
Immoral.
There is a theme here, and I'm not sure what to make of it.
I think she really wants to be an old man. I'm sorry. Here's my reading of it that um who do fascists value most? Well, actually, it's the virile young man, right? Probably, but the old man is the one who gets to be in power and gets to be in charge, and no one questions him because he has the power. That's my thought anyway. Is that she wants to be the power behind everything, or it could be a gender thing. I don't know.
This all is in addition to openly supporting universal suffrage for those 25 and older.
The conflict within her worldview.
Anyway, you begin to see why people like Oswald Mosley didn't like her.
Now, who's Oswald Mosley again?
He is a more well known British fascist who actually breaks from Rotha's organization because he doesn't view her as doing enough. He comes up later.
Right.
And now, despite the whole universal suffrage idea, Rotha does not appear to have much cared about women's right to work in the job market or sexual liberation or anything like that. She much preferred the idea of women sacrificing themselves for the nation, which plays a part in her disapproval of pacifism.
I mean, they do say that fascism is a death cult, and this makes sense with that.
I can see that, but to me, I've always gotten the feeling she just wants to go back to wearing a uniform and being an ambulance driver.
Hmm.
It's like adjusting to civilian life and an even worse job market for her than it would have been for the returning male soldiers is just not going well for her, from my viewpoint.
Yeah, no, I hear that reading.
And all this is before we get into what the BF actually did under her.
Yeah, what do these fascists do all day? Do they just march around in uniform?
It might as well be because, spoilers, it's rather tame for a fascist organization. They limited themselves to strike breaking and being bodyguards for right wing speakers at events. There's no intimidating elected officials, no tampering with elections in order to gain control of the government, hence why other fascists called the group a bunch of bloody fools.
Yeah, these guys are so lame.
Mosley, who we had briefly mentioned before, he actually went further and called the BF a group of 3 old ladies and a couple of office boys. This derision was probably a combo of Rotha being thought of as a mannish woman, and also over the fact
Ooh,
that the BF doesn't have an overall goal under her apart from a vague notion to disrupt the left side of politics.
I love this. So they're fascists, but don't get it twisted. They're not organized.
Not really. I always got the sense that it's very wishy washy in terms of what we do.
Hmm.
As to what the authorities thought of Rotha and her group, they considered her an irritant, and their documents on her are riddled with errors. In Julie Gottlieb's book on women and fascism, it's brought up that a 1924 report labeled her an ex suffragette, while they also presumed Rotha was married. The authorities also didn't like her for giving false reports of ammunition dumps, communist plots to harm property, and arms dealing with Soviet Russia. This is in addition to her claims that the BF had an in with the cops. For that last one, at least, Rotha was dragged in for an interview and given a warning. I could not find what might have been said in that interview, unfortunately, though I imagine it was a bit of an argument.
Yeah, no, this is reminding me of our last episode in that Rotha is appealing to an authority that she maybe doesn't always have.
Further, we know in 1927 that Rotha and members of her group were attacked in the East End by men and children.
And children.
Yes, which is a weird detail that I did
Mm-hmm.
not find a very good explanation for. In fact, I couldn't find the exact reason or details of the aftermath, unfortunately. That same year, Rotha was also witness in a trial for two other BF members who were charged with assaulting an undergraduate of Lincoln College, Oxford. I don't know exactly what she said, but the judge dismissed the case after hearing her testimony.
There we go again with the lack of details around her life.
As to what the BF was doing as the 1920s ended, it sounds like Rotha had gotten women to patrol the streets of London, similar to how Mary Allen had created women police volunteers earlier. While both groups may have been trying to rescue prostitutes, so to speak, I doubt Allen's group was also out to heckle communists like Rotha's was. I also say may in the case of the prostitutes because the writer Julie Gottlieb's research did not find evidence of that. She suggests that the person speaking of that confused Rotha with Allen, whom White in his article refers to as Rotha's friend. If you want to know more about her, we did an episode on her before this.
This is so wild, though, that they are just like not taken seriously to such a degree that they are confused with each other. That has got to sting for Rotha, who seems to be so focused on having power in this.
Is this the point where I interject and point out that even the internet kind of doesn't fully take her seriously, considering Reddit is calling her tomboy, dommy, fashy mommy?
Oh no, Reddit! Why would you do that? She's still a fascist. So we don't have a lot of details about her and her activities, but I don't know. What do we know about this time period?
Some of the police reports are less about the BF's activities and more about Rotha's own self destruction, interestingly enough. There was talk of other members of the group encouraging her addictions to drugs and alcohol, which might have been an attempt to self medicate for shell shock, aka PTSD.
And this is because of her ambulance work?
Yes, which may sound surprising to some of you. In a brief tangent, shell shock was not limited to combat soldiers. It could and did extend to the medical personnel treating them, and that included the unpaid women volunteers, either as nurses or ambulance drivers. For instance, there is a memoir from Pat Beauchamp discussing when she witnessed a shell explosion and its aftermath. She wrote, "I shall never forget, and in fact cannot describe. I leave the details to your imagination, but it gave me a sudden shock to realize that a few minutes earlier, those remains had been living men walking along the road, laughing and talking." In the case of Rotha, she'd have been driving, possibly at night, from a closer to the front aid station to pick up the wounded and drive back along shelled, muddy roads with probably Hell's soft chorus of moans right behind her in the car. They could give way to screams at too many jolts. As an ambulance driver, you'd be doing this day in and day out. You'd see people with missing limbs, blood caking the bandages and leaking through, half a face missing, people who'd been left to start rotting of gangrene before anyone could bring them back from no man's land between the trenches. You could even be wounded yourself, as that driver, Pat, whom I quoted, lost her leg, albeit from her ambulance getting hit by a train at a crossing that had no signals. But the possibility of getting hit by a shell behind the front lines was higher than you'd think. And that is just a brief look. There are some great descriptions in technically the fictional book Not So Quiet, but it is said to have been heavily inspired by an unnamed woman ambulance driver's journal that the writer borrowed. If you would like to dive into further descriptions, Unfortunately, I cannot recommend many memoirs because I have not encountered many, partly due to the emphasis of women's war work being on the nurses who worked just as hard. But to sum it up, Rotha probably did have some PTSD from ferrying the wounded to hospitals during the war and would have received even less help than the male combat soldiers who already didn't receive much.
Wow. So we have all of this wandering and lostness and fascism and trying to create order in the world. And it sounds like it is important to remember why she might be so lost and broken at this point.
In 1932, there is a brief report that she was ill after a heart attack and a fall which caused a concussion. Keep in mind, she is only 37 at this time.
Sorry, I was gonna say she's not that old at this point. That is wild.
In 1933, we have an account that Rotha's mother reported to the police that she believed orgies and other undesirable things were occurring at the town residence Rotha occupied and had been given by her mother.
That just sounds so completely out of character for her, right?
You mean Rotha's mother?
No, it sounds out of character for Rotha to be holding orgies. That doesn't sound very fascist.
This is where that part I said about rumors to discredit her come in. We can't really tell.
So a mystery.
If such a thing were to have occurred, I would suspect there would be heavy drug use to the point where a person would be completely out of it, completely unable to determine what's going on or do anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
But as a result of these rumors, her mother reduced Rotha's allowance.
So she's still relying on her mother's allowance by this point.
By the sounds of it, yes.
I guess being a fascist doesn't pay.
New tagline.
Yeah, maybe that's our ending thing.
Supposedly, a friend made a similar claim to the police that same year.
Oh, so we've corroborated the orgies.
I don't know for certain.
But there is mounting evidence.
There is mounting evidence that there is a spiral going on with Rotha and with the organization she's created. In 1934, it said that she had not been active in the BF for a while. Rotha may have been trying to recover from another illness brought on by excessive drinking. In short, things are not going well, not only for her health but also for the BF, as Mosley's group, which he created after he left them, was starting to outshine them in the British far right movement scene. In fact, at one point, Mosley bombed her headquarters and clubbed 4 people over the head during it.
Excuse me? Did the police know? Did he get in trouble? That just seems excessive, even for the fascists.
I would like you to think over the statement excessive even for a fascist for a moment.
Until now, we've seen them, maybe intimidating some strikers, but we haven't seen them bomb each other. I guess this is the mid 30s.
It is indeed the mid 30s, and I can't tell you what the police did in response. I assume there was some hullabaloo over it because just bombing a building in a city is not going to go unnoticed.
Right? They must have had some sort of like power that allowed them to think they could get away with that.
Well, Mosley's group was more powerful and larger than Rotha's by this point.
So this isn't just an attack, it's also a power play.
Probably. But either way, Rotha isn't around to deal with it. In 1935, she takes a vacation to the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa, presumably to try and deal with both her declining health and her fading sense of purpose in the post war world.
Our fascist is going to Africa to heal?
There's a lot that contradicts each other in this story.
Yes.
Either way, she would die there at age 39. She was then buried in a cemetery soon after.
Wow. So not only is had she gone to Africa for her health, she is in fact buried in Africa. The the least make Britain British again thing that she could have done.
After Rotha's death, her organization's finances were in a shambles. In 1935, there was a meeting over its remaining assets. As I am not a legal expert and there's a bit of jargon here, I will say that it sounds like something like bankruptcy occurred for the BF in 1935. Her organization presumably dies not long after she does. It is certainly eclipsed in history of this period by Mosley's group. As to what we get for Rotha's legacy, you could go several routes. Starting official fascism in Britain is certainly one. It's terrible and cannot be understated, by the way. Looking at it, one can also learn more about how people can end up as fascists, and fascism in general is something that does need to be discussed periodically so people can learn to guard themselves. At the same time, I see Rotha's story as a bit of a sad tale. You have a woman come back from the absolute devastation of the First World War to a nation that has no use for her as an ambulance driver. She has shell shock from her service. She's confused and floundering in the adjustment to civilian life. She's looking for something to fill the void of the military, essentially, and the society she's in also has fewer such meaningful jobs for women. Few women are involved in politics through official channels at this time, and I have always felt that in desperation, she latched on to the first thing that came her way, like a drowning man grabbing floating driftwood.
Sad look at the state of Britain after the First World War. That all of the best and brightest were turning to fascism.
I wouldn't necessarily go so far to say best and brightest. We have no idea enough about Rotha to make that statement.
That's true. Well, she had a lot of money behind her, and we know that even though there was a lot of sexism in the movement, she still was able to lead an arm of a fascist party without getting deposed. So, I'd say that she had something going for her, and if she turned all of that to union organizing, then she would have been a great asset. Maybe helped more dispossessed people who were out of a job that way.
Anyway, thanks for listening to Paris Lesbos, where we dig into the forgotten stories of Sapphic women, mainly from the Belle Epoque to the Second World War. You can rate us on whatever podcast app you use. You can leave a comment on YouTube. We enjoy hearing from you, and we welcome tips or suggestions on who we should do an episode on next. And remember, fascism doesn't pay. You can be 37 and still relying on your mother.